think we shall make a start, ladies and gentlemen. So we're 5 minutes in, and yes, our latest numbers are 11 actually as we speak. So welcome everyone to this Regen seminar on EVs, electric vehicles and the electricity system. I'm Merlin Hyman, I'm Chief Exec of Regen, and I will be trying to facilitate, broadcast. I don't quite know what it is on a webinar, what the right terminology is, but so yeah, I'll be trying to keep things moving and under control. Thank you very much to all 300 plus of you who have joined so far. Just note from me to hope you're all safe and well in what obviously are different and challenging times. So, but thank you very much for taking time to join us today. Let's go with broadcasting, shall we, from home in Bath. And we have our producer, Rachel, who is the kind of Regen logo there, who's buried in deepest Devon, who apparently has very good Wi-Fi connection out in the sticks in Exmoor. So we'll be relying on that. Do you want to say hello, Rach? Hi. And then we have...
Hi, everyone.
We have a panel of experts from who are spread around the country, particularly London, I think, but around the country. So with 7 or 8 of us on there swapping and with screen sharing and things, I'm sure there's absolutely nothing can go wrong. It's all going to be absolutely, absolutely smooth. Session we have, I think we all know that transport is, I think, become the largest source of carbon emissions in the UK. So addressing that is clearly absolutely critical for our net zero objectives and plans. Now that's a big shift, and a big part of it is electric. It's a switch to electric vehicles. So not all of it, but a big part of that shift of trying to decarbonise our transport sector, how we all move around, is about shifting from fossil fuel cars to electrically fueled cars. That's obviously a lot about decarbonisation. I suppose some of the events recently have raised the question of air quality quite a lot, and electric vehicles obviously also have a very significant potential role to play there in addressing air quality issues in some of our cities on a longer term basis than perhaps current situation is leading to. So really critical issue, and one of the key questions in trying to decarbonise in transport and trying to shift to electric vehicles is the question of where the energy comes from. I mean, we're going to have to shift that whole logistics chain we've used of oil and gas, from fuel tankers and refineries and petrol stations, all to get the energy into our vehicles, and shift that all onto the electricity system. And that obviously raises a big question of, can the electricity system cope? How is it coping? What do we need to do to adapt? What are the challenges? And also, what are the opportunities? Are there ways that as we make this shift that with innovation and new thinking, that we can actually do things in the energy sector a little bit better? So that's a key issue. And then amongst the whole kind of government process of the ban on fossil fuel vehicles, the consultation bringing that forward to 2035, the road to zero, that whole kind of major policy edifice, this issue of the electric vehicle and the electricity sector, and is a key part of this transition. So Regen's kind of role in life is we're trying to champion the transformation of the energy system for a zero carbon future. So this is an area we've been thinking about and looking at a lot. And setting up this forum we did that about 18 months ago, and that was a way of trying to bring together some of these two quite different sectors, the transport sector and the energy sector, to try and have more productive conversations, break down some of those barriers. And I think particularly when we set that up 18 months ago, that was still perhaps an early stage. I think that's developed, but we still think there's a very strong place for a dialogue and discussion about this challenge of electrifying vehicles and how we do that in a compatible way with our electricity infrastructure. So that's very much the aim of this forum. Previous ones have obviously been done in person. This one is we're doing a little bit differently, but the format, the agenda, broadly similar. It's pretty simple. We're starting with a presentation from our friends at OLEV, the Office of Low Emission Vehicle, and that presentation will be kind of setting the scene of what government's doing at the moment. Thanks, Rach, there for putting up the agenda. So you'll see me perhaps go small on your screen, hopefully, and you'll see the agenda there. So we'll be starting with Aaron about what government's doing, and particularly about Project Rapid. We'll then be hearing a bit, just a brief bit about some work Regen's been doing at a very street level EV charging, and thinking about some of the implications of that. And then we're going into an expert panel for a discussion. And in that discussion, our focus today, each of the times we run these forums, we run a focus on a particular area of this big topic, is about the rapid or ultra rapid, or whatever you want to call it, charging hubs. This idea that if we can put on our road, a strategic road network, 50 or so, numbers will vary depending on what projection you use, ultra rapid charging hubs that people can charge their EVs really quickly, then that will address a lot of the concerns and nervousness amongst those thinking of purchasing electric vehicles. And I think we all know from any surveys, or indeed our own anecdotal experience, that is obviously one of the big things that's of concern to people. You know, range anxiety. Can I make a long trip in my EV? And as a first generation Leaf owner, I'm very aware of that, and the challenges of queuing for available charging on the current system. So that raises a whole load of questions. How many of these hubs will there be? How are we paying from them? There were some big announcements in the budget, including hard cash from the Chancellor on that. How big will they be? How big do we need to build them so that they'll accommodate in the future? How big a grid connection? Will they be transmission or distribution connected? What's the business model behind them? How quickly are these things? Are we trying to bring these things on stream? And how do they fit within the overall kind of charging behaviour of EVs in the future? So lots, I think, to get at in the discussion. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say in the name of introduction. I should just briefly introduce you at this point to everyone who's going to take part, I think. So we have Aaron Berry, who will be up first from OLEV. Thank you, Aaron. We have Tom Hurst from Fastned, Millie Pardo from Pivot, Paul Jewell from Western Power Distribution, and Sarah Lane from Zook. So thanks to all them for giving their time, and we'll be bringing them in as we go in. We also have Joel then from Regen. Traditionally, the last thing I'd say perhaps is traditionally these forums that Regen runs, we're very keen to make them as participative and engaged as possible. There's a huge amount of expertise amongst the, how many is this at the moment? Just check our last number, 372 of you on the connected today. There's a huge amount of expertise there. Obviously, that's a little bit more difficult in this format. So we're just going to use the Q&A facility within the Zoom webinar for you to type in your thoughts or questions, and I'll just try and sort of bring those together in some of the themes that emerge. So with so many people, I doubt we'll be able to kind of just take individual questions on their own, but hopefully it'll be pretty clear the kind of themes that people want to know more about and want to probe more about. So we'll be using that to then ask the panel to respond to your questions, and hopefully that will make it as participative as we can. Okay, on that note, I am going to now hand over to Aaron to give us a bit of an overview of the work of OLEV and kind of government policy on the whole Road to Zero strategy. Aaron.
Okay, thank you, Merlin, for that introduction. And it's my first time presenting to a conference in this format. As for many, it's slightly surreal. And I've noticed, I don't know if I'm showing up strangely, but my shirt is showing up on my screen, at least, as slightly sort of psychedelic. So perhaps first lesson is don't choose a stripy shirt. Anyway, yeah, thank you for inviting me along. Fantastic to see virtually see such an enormous audience. difficult to not have the sort of the visual feedback that you would normally get. But yeah, well, I'll do my best. And I think I don't have control of the slides. If you could move to the first slide, please. Then, oh, do you have to? No, I'm getting peppered by emails in the meanwhile. Anyway, so yeah, so I'm going to cover today, sort of set the context for this discussion. So that, clearly we're talking about the transition to EVs. The government currently has a consultation out on bringing forward the date to the end of the new sales of internal combustion engine vehicles in the traditional sense. So set out in the Road to Zero, it was 2040 as an end date. Government currently consulting on bringing that to 2035 or earlier. That consultation was due to end in May. It has been extended out to July, not surprisingly, given the current context with COVID, etc. I'll move on to sort of give an update on sort of where we're at generally from a government perspective and sort of progress, the support on offer and the regulation in this space. Something specifically on Project Rapid, so that's the main focus of this event, is around rapid charging, so I'll talk about that a little bit. Most recently, the budget announcement, because as Merlin indicated earlier, and many of you will be aware, there was a fairly big announcement in the budget on infrastructure funding going forward, and then a little bit about next steps. So next slide, please. So yes, the big consultation came out at the beginning of this year, bringing forward the end to the sale of internal combustion engines. What was significant, I guess, in the consultation announcement was not just the date moving to 2040 to 2035 or earlier, but also the scope of the consultation to include hybrids for the first time. They weren't included in the initial sort of Road to Zero scope. So it's quite a significant move by the government to end the sales earlier and more widely than previously. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So why are the government doing this? Well, obviously, the context is all about climate change. Big change from the Road to Zero to the consultation this year was the net zero change, the change to the Climate Change Act to make the government's ambition on reducing carbon emissions even greater than previously. We had advice from the Independent Committee on Climate Change, who are the government's advisors on addressing climate change, that we would need to bring forward the date to the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles earlier if we were going to achieve our net zero ambitions in 2050. And consistent advice was also around ending the sale of hybrids as well. Not surprising, given that petrol and diesel vehicles have quite a long shelf life. If they're still on the road, if we're still selling new ones in 2040, they will still be on the road in 2050, which would make a net zero target even more challenging. So that's the sort of basic, unsurprising logic behind the consultation. Next slide, please. If we've got a slow internet connection or what, it's taking a while to come through. There we go. So yeah, so I think this is, I've been in government quite some time. I think this is the shortest government consultation document I've ever seen. It's yeah, a novel approach. It'll be interesting to see how it works through, but astonishingly, there are 5 questions, and I had a call from a few people after they saw it, wondering where the document was. Where's the normal typical 100, 200 page government document? There is none. This is it. These are the questions. So short and yeah, refreshingly concise. So interested in views on the phase out date, definition of what should be phased out. So do we phase out the hybrids or not? Critically, what are the barriers to achieving the ambitions set out in the consultation? the impact of these ambitions on different sectors of industry and society. And I think impact needs to be interpreted both positively as well as negatively. It sounds like it sort of has a negative connotation, impact, but there are undoubtedly opportunities from the move to net zero and increased electrification, not least in the infrastructure sector. So it's important we get the sort of a positive evidence as well as the undoubted downsides. And possibly most critical of all, what measures are required by government and others to achieve the earlier phase out date. And hopefully we'll get some good discussion today around what we need to do, what I need to be doing, and advising ministers to achieve what is undoubtedly quite an ambitious move by the government. So next slide, please. So the consultation process.
Looks like Aaron has finished there, but you were just off for a moment there, Aaron. So I think you're coming back. Joys of internet connections.
Sooner than that. Okay, next slide, please. I think that's it on the consultation side of things. So yeah, just an overview on progress in this space, and there undoubtedly has been the rate of progress has been increasing over time. So over 3% market share of cars in 2019. Anybody's guess what it will be in 2020? Undoubtedly it will be higher though. Vans are a little bit behind, but still moving upwards. A lot of taxis on the streets, and that's one of the sort of huge benefits in the EV space, given that they tend to be operating in an urban environment, certainly in London, where there are major air quality impacts. So some major advantages in having taxis electrified. So the discussion today, public charge points, rapid charge points, so 24,000, and that's ticking up fairly quickly, over 2,400 of which are rapids. Sarah will probably tell me later that's even a little bit higher than that. Over 120,000 domestic charge points installed, and over 50 councils applied for funding to install on-street charging. And the Secretary of State, Grant Shapps, wrote out to all council leaders at the end of last year, encouraging them and yes, strongly encouraging them to get on with their strategies for rolling out on-street and charging in that space. In terms of increasing uptake of ULEVs specifically, now my slides are behind yours. So we have the plug-in car grant, and it was announced that was extended at the budget, Go Ultra Low campaign, Energy Savings Trust, fleet reviews, various tax measures and new tax measures came in at this budget. We have a green number plates consultation going on at the moment, and the government also have their own fleet commitment to make sure that we are practicing what we are preaching. Next slide, please. So the next slide is on supporting infrastructure. So we believe we have one of the best infrastructure networks in the world at the moment, but clearly there is more to be done to support the sort of EV uptake that we would like to see in the next decade or two. So we've been consulting on smart charging requirements for charge points. That consultation has closed and we've been gathering the responses to it, but that's all about ensuring that we can make most of the benefits to moving to EVs, to minimize the costs of charging, the overall costs on the network. If people can charge overnight when demand is relatively lower, we can minimize overall impacts on the network, minimize costs for consumers, and also minimize the costs of recharging vehicles. We have on-street, workplace and residential grant schemes. And again, at the budget, there was good news in terms of extending support across all of those areas. So we are continuing with our home charge scheme, with our workplace charge scheme. For on-street, the support was doubled. In fact, it was quadrupled in the last couple of years. So from 2.5 to 5, and then to £10 million for this year for on-street charging. Rapid charging supports, that's something that we're looking at, and I'll come on to that in a bit. We have also a consultation on building regulation changes. This has partly come through EU legislative requirements, but the UK is going a little bit further in this space. So requirements for new homes and car parks to have a charge point, an element of destination charge points, and making sure that we're future-proofing. So obviously cheaper to build the infrastructure as you go along, rather than to retrofit. We have the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund, which Sarah can expound on later. And we have been encouraging charging companies to make sure that payments can be made through credit and debit cards. So dealing with the sort of the consumer experience of charging, making that easier than it is sometimes. Next slide, please. So on this next slide is on Project Rapid specifically. So this certainly that's a part of the focus of today. This was announced by Theresa May last summer, which seems like a million years ago, doesn't it? I mean, it was less than a year ago. Different Prime Minister, very different times. But the goal of this project was to look at what we would need to do to give consumers confidence to use electric vehicles for those longer journeys. So one of the major barriers to the uptake of electric vehicles is convincing consumers, convincing ourselves perhaps, that the EV is not only a good second vehicle choice, it's actually a realistic proposition as your only vehicle. And it's those sort of apocryphal journeys to Scotland that people worry about, even though relatively speaking we do very few of those longer journeys. It's undoubtedly the case, and various research has demonstrated that consumer anxiety around those long journeys is something that's halting or stopping many of us from purchasing those vehicles. So that was one of the key aims, to try and get over those sort of consumer anxiety issues. Another was to set a vision for rapid charging to help direct and catalyse investment to build out the infrastructure required. So to have some sort of joint understanding as to what our infrastructure needs actually are across the strategic road network. And that's been the focus of Project Rapid. So around the strategic road network, and particularly focused on the motorway service areas. So the scope of the review has been primarily around rapid and high-powered charge points. Initially, it was looking at sort of 50 kilowatt. That was raised to 150 kilowatt as the project developed over time. So both charge points and associated electrical capacity, and that's an important point for anybody who's been working for any length of time in this space. The cost of making those connections are clearly a key barrier in terms of ensuring rollout of infrastructure. Public locations along the strategic road network has been the focus, and as I said, a lot of the research that we've done has focused primarily on motorway service areas in particular, which is sort of quite an easier area to focus specifically on. Once you start extending into A roads, the variety of different needs becomes rather more challenging to assess. And the focus has been on the demand from cars and vans rather than extending, for example, into possible needs for HGVs, heavy goods vehicles, in the future. That was a decision taken fairly early on. The rationale for which was primarily that we don't really know for sure what the future is for the energy needs for HGVs at the moment, in the same way that we feel we do understand what the energy drivers for cars and vans will be. There's questions around whether hydrogen will be the answer on the heavy goods vehicles, for example. Clearly, the further out into the future you look, the greater the uncertainty there is. And even with cars and vans and the work we've done on Project Rapid is clearly illustrated, there is a great deal of uncertainty that remains in terms of what our infrastructure needs actually are. Even at individual service stations, what will we need in terms of energy provision in 2030, 2035, 2040? There are wide bounds of uncertainty in this space. If you bring in other areas like HGVs, that becomes even greater. So the study has assessed what the current provision is, both in terms of sort of number of charge points, but also the consumer experience of those charge points, so the reliability, the ease of payment, etc. Tried to assess what demand will be in the future. We conducted a fairly extensive analysis, both externally through our consultants, Arup, and internally, a lot of modelling to try and understand what demand will be in the future. Huge uncertainty in this area, as I've indicated. So it depends on not only the uptake of electric vehicles, the rate of uptake over time, but also the technologies. So what will the charging speeds be? How big will the batteries be? What's the consumer behaviour in terms of where they'll be travelling, whether further out into the future when we're looking at perhaps autonomous vehicles, ownership models may change. So quite a lot of uncertainty. The further out you look, the more uncertain the world becomes. Trying to understand the investment pipeline. So what will the private sector invest in? How many charge points are the MSAs and the charge point operators intending to roll out over time at motorway service areas? How does that compare with our understanding of increased demand over time, and how well do they match up? Looking at current market barriers, so connections I've already mentioned, is something that we hear a lot, unsurprisingly. And then finally, and of most interest to us and to our ministers is well, what is the role of government in this space? What is it that we need to do versus what the market will deliver? Difficult questions, but these are the questions that policymakers and ministers have to grapple with across a range of issues on a regular basis, of course. So just moving on to the next slide. The budget 2020. Get there eventually with the slide. There we go. So budget 2020, delivering on our promises to the British people. Bold title there. So there are a couple of bits in the detail of the budget in this space. So in paragraph 2.110, or electric vehicle charging infrastructure investment and review. So this is where we got an announcement that there would be £500 million over the course of the next spending review period for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which was fantastic news. So this was something that we have worked on, particularly in the context of Project Rapid, and made a case to Treasury that there was an element of market failure in this space. So fundamentally, the assessment, our assessment of the position across the strategic road network was that provision would not match our anticipated demand over time. So, and one of the main elements of market failure in this space was the cost of connections versus the revenue that would accrue to CPOs, charge point operators, in this space, particularly given the uncertainties around electric vehicle uptake from an investor perspective. So we put in a bid to the budget, and we were very pleased with the outcome in terms of having £500 million allocated into infrastructure in this space. And as you can see from the text there, if you can read it, it was focused in particular on the costs of connecting high-powered charge points, so addressing connection costs rather than the charge points themselves necessarily. There was a bit of a sting in the tail to the announcement, insofar as to ensure we could allocate those funds effectively, we would be carrying out a comprehensive review of electric charging infrastructure to build on previous review announced in last summer. So to build on the previous review we'd done, which was Project Rapid. So the story behind that was really to demonstrate to the Treasury that the right place to be spending £500 million was around the MSAs and connection costs. We need to make the case, well, what's the bigger picture in terms of our infrastructure needs? Is this the right place to be spending £500 million? What are the needs across the wider strategic road network, rapid hubs, across the wide array roads, etc.? So the infrastructure review is intended to look across the piece at our charging needs to make sure that we are spending the money in the right place. The other sort of major announcement of the budget, apart from the extension of grants for infrastructure, was the extension of consumer incentives for the vehicles. So the plug-in car grant will be extended until 2022, 2023. So a couple of years of certainty in that space, which is clearly important in maintaining the momentum that we have already in terms of the uptick of electric vehicles. So some really positive news in the budget. More work to be done in terms of developing the business case around Project Rapid in particular, and quite how we allocate that £500 million. But really, really positive overall. And now next slide, please. So I think I've already covered some of the detail of this. So the budget announced the sort of continuation of our home charge scheme, of the on-street residential scheme, and of the workplace charge scheme. The rates have come down slightly on the home charge scheme and the workplace charge scheme, which largely reflect developments in the industry. It means we can get more bang for our buck in terms of the number of charge points that are supported by the fund. And finally, next steps. So the outcome of the 2035 consultation is obviously really important. So the government will set a date to the end of electric vehicles, or at the end of internal combustion engine vehicles, in terms of new sales, and presumably set out sort of the policies that will ensure we achieve that end date. So in the Road to Zero, the end date was set at 2040, but that wasn't put into regulation. It was left to sort of encouraging incentives and so forth to achieve that. I think one of the big questions around moving to an earlier end date is whether the market will
Looks like we have another glitch there on Aaron's section. Sorry, you glitched for a bit there, Aaron, but you're back now.
Oh, okay. Oh yes, it says my internet connection is unstable, but okay.
It's not a good sign.
Okay, so there's 2035 consultation. Yes, this comprehensive energy infrastructure review. So my team is already working on that. So looking at the sort of wider context of our infrastructure needs, and I'll be very interested in the panel debate today to hear about sort of your assessment, the panel's assessment, and the audience's assessment of what our needs are in this space. Government also published a decarbonising transport document called Setting the Challenge. Went out after sort of the COVID hit, so it was a relatively low-key publication, but it was sort of setting out what the challenge is in terms of achieving decarbonising transport, but also clarified that we'll be publishing a transport decarbonisation plan by the end of this year. And obviously the work of OLEV is really key in terms of delivering decarbonised transport. And finally, the budget and spending review. So we're expecting an autumn fiscal event, an autumn budget. Spending review is due. We had been anticipating that in the autumn. Given the current conditions, it may be pushed back slightly. We'll have to watch this space in terms of precisely when that will be. But we are clearly working quite hard towards ensuring that the rapid charging fund and appropriate support for infrastructure is a part of that. So that was it for me. Thank you very much. I think my details are on the final slide. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the debate.
Schoolboy error there of muting myself. Thank you very much, Aaron, for the for that run through of everything that government's doing. It's a list, and it looks like the sort of bullet points in the slide can sort of slightly underplay. There's obviously a huge amount going on in this space. Just a couple of been lots of points coming in on the Q&A, so thank you everyone for that. I think we might provide that to you afterwards, Aaron, to give you some consultation, live consultation, if you like. Just as a clarification, is this from one? Is this England only, the 500 fund, or is it? Yeah, what's the scope?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, the 500 million is England only. There's something called a Barnett formula, which so basically the devolved administrations will get budget reflective of that, but it will be for the devolved administrations to determine how to spend that money. And obviously in both Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, there are plans in place in terms of infrastructure. I know Wales are doing quite a lot in this space, but we'll be talking to them about the review that we are doing and try and be sort of joined up on that front.
Okay, excellent. Some other quick thoughts that come out of this. There's a sort of general question. I think that's Stuart over at Centrica on the kind of response of the vehicle manufacturers to the 2035 deadline, and it's not an easy one to respond to, I guess, but generally, I guess the engagement of vehicle manufacturers in this whole process, and whether it's changed, whether you're able to give us any insight into, is there furious lobbying from some industry to slow it down, and what have you feel you're able to?
So there's been a lot of engagement with industry at various levels. I think it varies somewhat between different manufacturers. So Tesla, for example, are unsurprisingly quite keen on the whole approach. I think perhaps one of the biggest sort of concerns is around hybrids. So the scope of the consultation, as much as the date. I think some manufacturers have seen hybrids as a really key stepping stone, and I think that is not necessarily inconsistent with the consultation. I mean, there are still, even if a date was set for 2035, that there are still 15 years so plenty of time for that. But yes, clearly it is a challenging and controversial change to an industry that's been established for over a century.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm right in saying the Scottish Government has an even more ambitious 2032, is that right? Deadline that's already announced as well. So, just some points we'll get into in the discussion with the other panelists, but there was a more specific one on Rapid about, when you might come out with your locations. I know National Grid a year or so ago published their kind of 54 plans, which all seem to be quite close to National Grid infrastructure as well. So, but when might people expect to see some kind of location plan?
I think so. It's very difficult. Quite frankly, it's very difficult to say, particularly given the current environment. The scope of Project Rapid was across all of the MSAs. So we have done in
that's
terms
motorway
of
service areas, in case anyone's lost, I guess.
Yeah, so we were looking at all of the motorway service areas and what the charging requirements would be at all of those service areas over time. We've engaged with the owners of all of the service areas.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm sure that's a topic we'll come back to. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you very much, everyone, to their thoughts and questions. And sorry we can't get to all of those, but hopefully we'll pick up on them as we go along. So I was just going to come to Joel from Regen very quickly. We've been doing Regen does quite a lot of work on future energy scenarios for DNOs, including in fact, it was work we developed really with Western Power Distribution and Paul over 4 or 5 years now, and with local authorities and with others. And we've just been doing a piece of work actually with colleagues of Paul, so to speak, Scottish and Southern Electricity Network, on some highly kind of granular substation feeder level. So that's sort of 8-house kind of projections of the take-up of electric vehicles. Obviously, these projections are really important in thinking about what charging infrastructure you need. It's a bit of a chicken and egg as what you build and what you might need and how customer behaviour will evolve. And that's something, again, we'll come back to, I'm sure. But it has some quite interesting implications, I think, for this thinking. And Joel had to cope with, I think, 1 billion different values in numbers in terms of that projection. So it shows how big these data sets get if you start to try and project this stuff at a very local level. Joel, do you want to give a very quick insight into that?
Thanks. Yeah. We've worked with several different DNOs since about 2015, producing those projections for changes in demand and generation technologies, which has predominantly been focused on those technologies connecting to their higher voltage networks. However, for some low carbon technologies, there is a need for a more granular forecast to provide an evidence base to support the development of low voltage networks. So over the last few months, we've worked with Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, SSEN, to analyse high granularity projections for heat pumps, rooftop solar PV, and more pertinent to us here, EVs and EV chargers. And we've done this, as you say, down to street level, which is for about 500,000 or so feeders and secondary substations in SSEN's 2 licence areas. So yes, the database got pretty large by the end of it. So in addition to projecting national en route charging infrastructure, that Project Rapid is focusing on deploying, as Aaron just discussed. Our study has also investigated a scenario-based approach to project the uptake of 8 different EV charger archetypes, including national and local en route chargers, workplace and fleet, and depot, destination and car parks, and then on and off street domestic residential chargers. So I've put out a few lessons from this highly granular study that might be of interest or are associated with rapid charging. For example, our we've confirmed our previous suspicions that there will be a need for more public charging locations, likely including local rapid charging hubs in less affluent areas, in order to provide fairer access to EVs. This is since the availability of on and off-street parking is closely associated with lower and higher levels of affluence. And so, particularly in towns and cities, as the graphic on the left of the slide illustrates, there are large areas with little off-street parking availability. For context, that's about 40% of homes in SSEN's southern licence area don't have access to off-street parking. As a result, these areas will need more near-home public charging, potentially including local rapid charging hubs to enable the uptake of EVs for homes that don't have access to off-street parking. The risk here is clearly that if affluence is given too much significance as a driver for the uptake of an EV charging network, the network investment will be channeled to more affluent areas, and that would create inequitable access to EVs in the future. Another interesting area of analysis was thinking about what a net zero EV scenario could look like, and what the impact to charging infrastructure could be if we reduce the gross number of vehicle miles or the total number of vehicles. So the resulting bespoke net zero scenario that we produced has less need for charging infrastructure in the long term as a result of those factors, but that does need that infrastructure quicker than the less ambitious scenarios, which results in greater uptake in the near term. It was also interesting looking at the baseline of existing EV chargers in SSEN's licence areas. For example, in their Scottish licence area, around 3/4 of EV chargers are operated by Charge Place Scotland, which is a national grant-funded network of chargers developed by the Scottish Government. And that's resulted in a more centralised approach to EV charging infrastructure. But in SSEN's southern licence area, the majority of charging infrastructure is operated by private ventures, and that's resulted in a more decentralised approach to EV charging compared to the Scottish. So the study's report will be published in the coming weeks, and that will include some results and a high-level methodology, or do get in touch directly if you'd like to find out more.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Joel. It sort of relates a little bit to one of the questions, and we'll come back to. There's I think one of the questions that's coming in is, what does OLEV and of course the DNOs and National Grid and everyone else involved think is going to be the mix of how many people are going to be charging at home, how many people charging on car parks, workplace, or on the strategic road network. And of course that's a critical question. If you've got these are long-term infrastructure investments, are long-term investments. You need to prepare the infrastructure. Paul needs to make sure his infrastructure is ready to cope, and so he has to have some idea of where everyone's going to charge. And so Regen, along lots of other people, have been spending quite a lot of time scratching their heads about what that might look like in the future, and what you come down to is some sort of scenario-based approach, which lets Paul then plan for lots of different scenarios. So I'm not sure it makes his life that much easier, but at least it gives him some kind of frame of reference. We'll see what he thinks about that. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to come to more of the kind of panel discussion now, and so I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to kind of introduce themselves, have a little bit of perspective on their view on the kind of ultra rapid charging hub, the kind of approach, and maybe pick up on any particular points from Aaron's presentation that they wanted to zoom in on, so to speak, and highlight. Okay, so we're going to start with Tom from FastNed. I'll let you do the kind of introductions for yourself, Tom, rather than saying too much, and over to you.
Thanks, Merlin. And can you just confirm that you can hear me okay?
It's a little bit quiet, but if you do,
sorry. Bear with me. So yeah, thank you very much for having me, guys at Regen. So, I mean, FastNed, our business, our company was founded in about 2012. And really what we do, for all intents and purposes, is we build petrol stations, but for electric cars. So to date, I mean, the business kicked off with the award of 200 concessions on the Dutch motorways to install and operate rapid charging hubs. And what that meant for us was then that as a business, we were able to really take the time to think and invest properly in highly visible infrastructure, good quality aspects like reliability, accessibility. Needless to say, it's funded by renewable energy. But yeah, I mean, actually, you would have seen one of our stations on the first slide of the presentation. That one hadn't actually got a roof on it yet, but we always install solar canopies on our high power stations. To date, we operate in the UK. We operate 98 stations now in the Netherlands. We've got about 15 or so in Germany, and we continue to build in all those countries, as well as Belgium, Switzerland, and we're growing across Europe as it stands. I guess I'm really here from the perspective of a company that is making these investments. We are doing it. We think the market is there, and we're a little bit confused why in some key high-value locations that the charging provision isn't quite there where it could be. And so I think that's an interesting area to sort of investigate further what the real reasons for that are, for example.
Can you give us any hints there, Tom?
Maybe later. I guess, yeah. I think it's worth noting we built, actually, I'm quite proud to say that we built the first, or we started operating the first high-power ultra-rapid charging hubs in Europe in 2017 in the Netherlands. We opened the first ultra-rapid charging hub in the UK last year. And we continue to build facilities that have got multiple rapid chargers to provide a really useful, I guess, value proposition for customers in terms of their reliability, the availability of chargers, for example. And we do so on a private basis. So yeah, we make sure that our investment goes a long way and is sustainable and incremental. But yeah, I'll hand back to you now.
Okay, just one follow up, and then something we'll keep coming back to. But on the business model, I guess, does it make money, and is it all the money from selling fancy lattes, or is it from charging people a lot for their electricity, or what?
Yeah, we only sell kilowatt hours, so that's the simple business model. You buy electricity from us like you would buy petrol from a petrol filling station. We're not cross-subsidizing with, as you say, a flat white or something. We do offer a membership, but really over sort of 80% of our customers charge pay as you go when they need it, because that's the service that we provide. So certainly it seems to be working so far. We were listed on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange last year. And at the end of last year, we broke even operationally. So the stations fund themselves. And yeah, we continue to push ahead, basically.
Okay. Is it fair to say that it's always going to be more expensive to charge out than at home? That seems to be the case at the moment. I think it costs me 2 or 3 times as much on a motorway service station at the moment.
Yeah, I think certainly right now, with the stage of the market, it makes sense that it would be more expensive because clearly there's a cost to the chargers themselves, there's a cost to the grid infrastructure, and the rest of the civils associated with your development. I mean, the solar canopies we install, they've got costs associated with them. The nice thing about rapid charging hubs is by co-locating all this infrastructure together in a single place, you operate it much more efficiently. You do see economies of scale that you might not see by rolling out individual chargers in terms of maintenance and all that sort of thing. And we greatly reduce the cost to serve. And by building a facility that's got very high levels of utilization, in the future, you'll see us able to do things like, off-peak discounts, for example. In the future, there's no reason why overall costs shouldn't go down, let's say in real terms. It's just a case of navigating the sort of the growth of the market, really. Okay,
thank you, Tom. Millie, let's come to yourself next. Pivot's had quite a lot of publicity for its plans and for large batteries and charging hubs and the like. Do you want to just give us a bit of a sense of how you see it developing?
Yeah, thank you, Regen, for inviting me to speak on this panel. I have been at Pivot Power for 2 years, since the company first formed. We were actually acquired by EDF Renewables at the end of last year, which has given us the financial backing to really progress with our plans. Aaron mentioned in his presentation about costly grid connections being one of the barriers to providing these ultra rapid charging hubs. And this is sort of an area what Pivot Power is trying to resolve. So we're developing a series of private wire networks that will provide affordable multi-megawatt capacity to specific locations, enabling the charging of electric vehicles at high speed. So we're connecting directly onto National Grid's transmission system. We've secured 40 connections onto National Grid substations across England and Wales. And these sites were chosen mainly due to their location. So they're on the edge of cities, towns, or close to the strategic road network. And in terms of sort of our experience, we, for the last 2 years, have been in continual discussion with a number of operators in the industry, charge point operators, super hub operators, motorway service areas, and on the fleet side, transport operators, bus companies. So we've got a real idea of kind of the challenges that they face on the ground when it comes to electrification.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Millie. Just very briefly, the decision to connect direct to the transmission network, obviously quite a significant one. Anything particularly reasons behind that, or?
So there are two aspects to our model. WireCo, which is what I've explained, our private wire network, delivering capacity within 5 to 8 kilometres of our transmission connection. And then we have BatteryCo. So the private wire will share the connection with a 50 megawatt battery. And the two models are pretty separate. As far as our customers are concerned, the battery is irrelevant, but it helps to explain the business model. The battery will trade in wholesale markets, absorbing energy when it's cheaper and selling it back to National Grid when there's demand for electricity. So helping to incorporate more renewables onto the grid at a national scale.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting to hear both speakers so far talk about, the role of renewable storage and kind of more, not just straightforward demand, but kind of perhaps more innovative approaches to trying to provide energy to people in a more decentralized system. Okay, on that note, talking about connections, I think I'll come to Paul from Western Power Distribution.
Yeah, good afternoon, Merlin. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, Paul Jewell from Western Power Distribution. To give you a context of Western Power, we're one of the distribution network operators in the UK. The map you saw from Joel had SSEN on it. They're our near neighbour down in the south, but actually our area is the southwest, South Wales, and the two sides of the Midlands, east and west. So in actual fact, every other network operator is our neighbour, because we've got quite a swathe across about a third of the UK with about 8 million customers. So we're one of the sort of bigger operators in that area. And yeah, we can talk from single domestic connections up to motorway service areas. It depends which way we want with this discussion to go. But if I answer one of your earlier questions, Merlin, about where people will charge, Electric Nation was a project we did a few years ago with about 700 electric vehicle users. They predominantly charged at home. Now, there was a bit of bias in the fact that they were early EV adopters who likely had access to a driveway or a garage. But people chose to charge at home because, as you said, it's cheaper. At the moment, it's normally cheaper to charge at home than it is to charge out and about. But what I've been picking up this year, which is an interesting contrast to that, is that electric vehicle users who used to be petrol car drivers and would have basically avoided motorway service areas as much as they could because of the higher price of petrol on motorway services, now actually plan MSAs into their route for two reasons. One is they know what the price is going to be before they turn up, because they're into a club or whatever, or some sort of an arrangement with a charge provider, so their price is fixed. And secondly, if you're going to be stopped for 15 or 20 minutes, you might as well stop somewhere nice where there's a toilet and a coffee shop. And so there's an interesting change, I think, in that customers who perhaps wouldn't have used a motorway service area before, when from a petrol point of view, it was about 5% of UK road fuel sales, might be moving towards choosing motorway service areas or the other hubs that are being provided as their place to get charge. And as Joel says, 40–50% of customers don't have driveways. So those are the customers that are going to be flocking to those hubs as electric vehicles become more prevalent.
Okay, but when we with a motorway service station, when you know there are various people trying to put in connections, or we have put in connections at the moment. You know, they'll be billed. You know, their business model probably doesn't let them put in 50, 150
Yeah.
what charge, what charges. It's likely to be a bit smaller than that, and then you presumably provide them the grid capacity for what they've asked for. But you know, presumably in a few years, all things being equal, we might expect to have more of these, more demand, more charges, and then we'll have to go through the whole process of reinforcing the network over again. So how does that process work properly at the moment, or is this something that Aaron should be fixing in his
Yeah, we've started the discussions with the motorway service areas, because as you say, Merlin, if you ask for a connection, we will give you a supply that suits that connection. If you then come back and ask for another one, there's a chance that we then need to redo works. When you're looking at the capacities that motorway service areas are looking for, which is 5, 10, 15 megawatts, something of that size, it's the capacity of a small town. So that that's the scale we're looking at. And for those customers, I think we'd be looking at going to 33,000 volt, going 1 voltage higher than we normally would to give them a connection. And what I genuinely don't want to do is have those customers pay for a connection at 11,000 volts just to come back 10 years later and us say to them, sorry for all that money you paid, but we need to start again at a different voltage. So there's a discussion that we're having, which feeds in beautifully to Project Rapid, to try and work out what the eventual maximum capacity is for those service areas. So that even if we don't put the correct size of transformer on site at the time, we make sure that the cables are laid in at the correct voltage. And we're just starting a little innovation project to try that at a motorway service area, to try and basically get a packaged small 33,000 volt substation that we could deploy to a motorway service area to provide the charging capacity they need.
Okay, what would that package? How many charges? How many charges could that? What's the I guess what's the current solution and what's the sort of better solution?
Yeah, we're looking at 6 megawatts or 12 megawatts as the sort of 2 standard sizes of those package solutions. So I'd have to do the maths and divide that by 150 or 300 kilowatt chargers, but it's quite a few.
How many? What would you typically provide at the moment? Sort of more like 1 or 2 meg.
Yeah, at the moment, customers are asking for a couple of megawatts, so they're looking for maybe 5 or 6 fast chargers. And the real nub of it is when we look at the quotes we've provided for them. It can be up to $1 million to provide that capacity at 11,000 volts, and it might not be much more to provide a more enduring capacity at 33,000 volts. So we really need to get the pricing right, if you like. That a customer might ask us for 1 capacity, but we want to understand their ultimate capacity before we start laying in assets.
Okay, and where you're I think required to offer the cheapest possible solution, aren't you, legally? So that's
yeah, we are. And if they just come and ask for a capacity, they'll get what they ask for, because that's the requirements of the law. But what we'd like to do is work with the industry and make sure we provide an enduring solution, which all goes back to our world, which is on asset lifetimes of 50 years. So you've got to be thinking now of what you need for full decarbonisation in the future past 2050.
Okay. Aaron, could I just perhaps before I come to Sarah, just come back to you briefly on that. Is there a problem here that the infrastructure we're putting in a whole bunch of infrastructure on motorway service stations, other strategic hubs that actually just isn't really fit for purpose, and anyone who's tried to charge their leaf, as I have on the motorway service network at the moment, can promise you the current infrastructure is not really fit for purpose. Is there a risk we just put in another sort of temporary solution rather than actually putting in the solution that's needed? And is that a potential market failure that government needs to intervene?
If you mean in terms of the sort of the capacity that it's being put in, one of the focuses of Project Rapid has been to try to identify what the needs will be out into the future, 2030, 2035, to try and ensure that we put in connections that can cope with that. So investing ahead of need. I think there is a question about quite how far ahead you do look. So Paul was suggesting, all right, well, should we be looking at 100% capacity EVs, which will push you out to sort of 2050 or so? And maybe we should, but the questions there are, well, we don't know about HGVs. You know, the further out into the future you look, the greater the uncertainty becomes, the greater the risk of investing more than you should, and it's a really tricky balance to undertake, because, you know, inherently we don't know the future. So yes, we want to future-proof and invest in some sort of future-proofed connections, but yeah, how far ahead do you look? And I think that is one of the big questions in this space. The other big one, and maybe even a bigger one, is the sort of the on-street issue, which was raised earlier. Yeah, what do you do with all the people that don't have off-street parking? Do they go to rapid hubs? Is that the right solution and destination charging, or does actually the government have a role in ensuring that everybody has access to home charging? One of my big concerns that's coming into this role is the sort of the issues around equality in this space. If you have access to home charging and you can charge overnight relatively cheaper, you're an awful lot better off than even if you do have an on-street charger, you're going to be paying more for it. And if you think how controversial fuel prices are, my last job was in fuel and supporting renewable fuel, and huge controversy on quite how much we pay for fuel. And, you know, we've had demonstrations over it in the past, of course, and that's when we're all paying the same amount. Now imagine a world in 10, 20 years time when, depending on where you live and to some degree how rich you are, you'll be paying a different amount to charge your vehicle. And those paying less will generally be better off. So that's a real concern looking out into the future, and we're effectively making those decisions now. So potentially storing up some really big challenges for the future.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Aaron. Okay, Sarah, Aaron talked about the problems about predicting the future. I guess as an investor, you sort of have to do that, because you have to decide which investments are going to be successful and which aren't, and based on their business plans and how they see the future. So Zook just perhaps explain a little bit about Zook and the charging infrastructure fund and how that kind of works, and then the sort of criteria you're applying when you're looking at charging, when you're looking at investments in this space, particularly perhaps towards the kind of bigger public rapid chargers.
Absolutely. So Zook is a private equity fund manager that's been investing in the sustainable economy since the early 2000s. Last year, we were appointed the preferred bidder for the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund, which went live in August. I think the public announcement was September, with the first closed. And we recently announced our second close for that fund. So we're now a 150 million fund dedicated to investing in public EV charging infrastructure in the UK. So I guess touching on what we mean by public, that's everything from your on-street residential chargers in towns and cities to your kind of destination-based rapid chargers to EV hubs and high-powered charging on the strategic road network. And we're also able to address the charging requirements for some fleets, including your kind of mobility service providers and some private fleets, providing there's an element of open access. So we have quite a broad mandate to address the public charging element. We obviously had to take into account that a lot of the charging won't be happening on this public network. So I think today about 80% of charging is taking place at home on residential chargers, and that's not the market we're addressing. We're looking just at the 20% today, which we do expect to go up over time as more people without off-street parking adopt EVs, but the people who will be charging in public. We have made the first investment from the fund, that was last year, in a company called Instavolt. Instavolt is a rapid charging network owner and operator. It's actually the largest owner and operator of rapid chargers in the UK. To date, I think they have just under 500 rapid chargers on the network. Their model is distributed rapid, so you won't find many locations where you have a bunch of installed chargers. There are the odd location where we've got kind of 8, but we're not talking about kind of 20 plus. Several locations you've got 1 or 2 chargers, but they're really the places where you go to stay for 1 hour. You plug in your car while you're at a supermarket, while you're stopping on the road to get a McDonald's, that kind of thing. We're looking to address the hub model, and it's certainly a big area from investment. But again, I think Aaron touched on a lot of the points in his presentation, where you've got the need for a highly reliable network where you've got several chargers, so people can turn up with a high degree of certainty that a charger will be there, it will be working, and it will be available. The capital commitment is so big, you need to be sure that those locations are the right locations to be. And I think a big prohibiting factor today is probably the grid element, but I think that there's a good kind of, hopefully, kind of combination of the CIF and perhaps Project Rapid in the future, whereby we can keep the commercial element and help to bring forward when we can realise some of those big hubs on strategic road network.
In terms of your thinking on the business model around that, the ultra rapid charging hubs, do you see a lot of people coming forward to you with attractive looking propositions, or is it a kind of real struggle for people to work out how to make it all add up?
I think there's lots of interesting developments out there, and we've certainly spoken to people with interesting propositions in the space. Quite a few things have to marry up when you're looking at new build hubs, so moving out the kind of MSA element where you've already got a retail offering and a reason for people to turn up there. If you're thinking of building a new build hub, you've got to put in retail or something for someone to do while their car's charging. You need to make sure that you've got enough EV chargers to satisfy the requirement of who's going to be turning up there. You need to put in the right grid infrastructure to support that. So the capital commitment is quite extraordinary, and you need to kind of marry up all of those with who your customers will be, and that could be very different depending on where you are. For example, if you're looking to put a hub near Heathrow, maybe most of your customers will be taxi drivers. If you're putting a hub, just outside West London, where you've got lots of expensive homes that don't have off-street parking, maybe your customers will be looking for a different retail offering. So there's so many things that have to marry up. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. And I think that's why it probably takes slightly longer to assess these kind of opportunities, but there's certainly lots of interesting ones in the market.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. Tom, just you're working across several markets. Do you want to just give us a sense of how you see the UK compared to, say, Holland or Germany? Are we miles behind? Have we got the right approach? Well, what can we learn from?
No, definitely not miles behind. A few years ago, we might have said that, and I didn't say miles, but it was a little bit. When you look in absolute terms, there's more or less the same number of EVs in the UK as there are in the Netherlands now. But in terms of penetration, it's a slightly different story. But it's growing rapidly. I think when you look at the charging market in particular, I think the UK can really sort of, celebrate the fact that it has developed a very active, very competitive, and innovative market across the charging field. So there are a number of companies with quality offerings in terms of what they do, provide for customers, the services, the speeds, and the technologies they're using now and developing in the future, both on and on the vehicle side as well. Obviously, I think that's a real achievement. Yeah, where we differ is the quality of provision on the MSAs compared to a number of other countries. Obviously, the route that the Netherlands went down was long concessions that enabled providers to install and only install, high power charging equipment. It's been left a little bit, I guess, to the market to deliver. And as it stands, what we see doesn't necessarily meet the needs of most customers. I mean, I drive a BMW i3. There are a number of MSAs I physically can't charge at because the charging provision there isn't available for all vehicles. That's a fundamental mistake from a commercial perspective, because that's customers you're losing as an operator. But for the strategic road network itself, it's again a fundamental issue. How do you drive forward provision of infrastructure for sustainable mobility with that kind of provision. So that's something that I hope is looked at in detail going forward with the likes of Project Rapid, for sure.
Aaron, I mean, that's a, you know, as an EV driver, you know, with the classic 15 apps or whatever it is, and I turn up and, you know, and some patchy provision and queues, etc. You know, is the government just not being interventionist enough in making sure that the you know, everyone can use all of the charges, and you're encouraging people to be able to pay with debit cards, but not requiring.
Yeah. Yeah. So
you go to a big motorway service area, you might sit there with your Leaf with 2 little chargers, and next door there's one Tesla with 12 shiny empty chargers. You know, it's kind of, you know, we need to be a little bit more interventionist in along the sort of lines Tom's suggesting that Holland has been there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I mean, the government have taken powers to intervene in this space under the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act. So sort of the primary powers are there. So legislating is a possibility. Grant Shapps is an EV owner himself, and he is very forthright in this space, I would say. So very keen that the provision of infrastructure is up to scratch, not only in terms of availability, but accessibility, reliability, ease of payment, etc. It is quicker for industry to respond than it is for government to legislate. So if you want quick action, it is better that industry respond. And I think that has sort of characterised the government's approach thus far. But I think ministers have been pretty clear that if they don't get the sort of response they would like to see, then ultimately they have the stick available, the stick of legislation. So that is a possibility. It's always a difficult balance to take between letting the market respond and going in with legislation. Once you do go in with legislation, you have to tightly define things quite carefully, and that can have unintended consequences, and it can actually slow things down in some instances. So, but yeah, it's a possibility.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Quite a few questions coming in from. Thank you to everyone there on the kind of the grid connection and the potential for more on-site batteries, local renewables that reduce the need for that grid connection. Do you, Paul? Do you see that? Do you see people using innovative solutions to try and reduce the size of the grid connection that they need? Local renewable storage kind of solutions, or do you think fundamentally people just need a solid connection to the network and that's not going to change?
Yeah, I think it depends on what space you've got available at your site. We've been looking at the motorway service areas. When I've been talking to them, I was thinking, what are you going to do about battery storage? What are you going to do about renewables? And they haven't got a lot of site available to them. There's not a lot of space available, a lot of motorway services. I think in actual fact, one of the things we looked at some of the Project Rapid forecasts and some other forecasts that we got done by an EV charge company is that at some of the sites, the sort of the ultimate amount of EV chargers that you've had, there wasn't enough space in the car park to put them all. So a site would be limited, if you like, by the physicality of what's there. But I am seeing the sort of the new site provision where you might have a solar panel array, a battery and an EV charger all co-located at the same place. And that's pretty cool, really. It actually, in one sense, it probably doesn't need to affect the WPD network or the DNO network. It could almost be standalone. But I do like the sort of the low carbon idea of pulling energy from the sun, storing it in a battery, and then putting it straight into cars. But I think the key thing that sets it aside from the motorway service areas that exist is that you need the land, the real estate, to be able to do that in the first place.
Okay, and are those sites, maybe you're not the right person to answer this one, but do your sense is those sites are providing services back to the network, then using their battery storage and along the lines Millie described? I'll perhaps come back to her on that. But or is that a bit of a gold at the end of the rainbow that isn't quite as valuable as perhaps people were hoping?
Yeah, it's outside of my area, but my guess is you would do, wouldn't you? Because if you've got battery storage available, you want to make the best use of it. So you want to stack your benefits with all the different markets that are available. So you will do some sort of time of use trading of the battery, as well as using it to provide the backbone power for your EV charging.
Millie, you described those kind of models. It's perhaps split with the battery co and the grid go, but definitely kind of models that are trying to use storage and solar, and not simply just build demand and put it into the network, but use the whole benefits of this smart decentralized system. Is that coming forward, or is it people finding it kind of harder than they thought, I guess?
Well, it's worth mentioning first, so our battery storage, it's not behind the meter, so it's not a local form of generation. It's actually very separate to our private wire connections that we offer. From our experience, speaking with various people in the industry who've been exploring different options for getting capacity, the economics don't always stack up when you're looking at behind the meter battery storage, on-site battery storage. I think in terms of when we're talking about ultra rapid charging hubs and we're looking long-term future-proof solutions, from our perspective, the key thing is having access to a multi-megawatt connection. So very much in agreement with Paul on your sort of ambition of megawatt capacity, 6-12 megawatts, whether that's for current demand, but then future demand as more electric vehicles are coming onto the road, larger vehicles, potentially electric trucks. I know, Aaron, obviously there is the uncertainty over some of these vehicles and when electric vehicles are going to really take off. I think where possible, if you can find a solution that caters for that uncertainty, then that's brilliant. Pivot Power's model has very much been designed around this uncertainty for charge point operators. So we are offering customers the ability to sign up for 1 megawatt in the short term, and then they can reserve future capacity ahead of time at a fixed rate. So it enables them to sort of plan ahead of time with confidence, knowing what the prices are going to be. And yeah, so giving that sort of confidence in the market.
Okay, and what sort of interest level are you getting in your, in accessing these connections, and trying to get a sense of, in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years before I can jump in my EV and confidently go between these hubs?
So as I said, we've got 40 connections onto National Grid substation, and we're rolling those out over time. So our first site is in Oxford, which will go live at the end of this year, Energy Super Hub Oxford. So there will be a super hub along the Oxford Ring Road, which will be accessible by the end of the year. And that actually, the scope of that project has been expanded thanks to government funding. So we received some funding from UK Research and Innovation. So we're working with multiple partners to maximise the opportunities really of the project, which I think is an example of how government can support in the rollout of these projects and making sure that they're future-proofed and providing the best opportunities that they can.
What does that mean in terms of future-proofing and new ideas and innovation? What does that actually mean, Millie? What would be different in a?
So I guess if you're digging up the road to lay down cabling and you're able to provide extra ducting to account for when there's demand for it. I think for the Oxford project, initially, with our own funds, we would have probably provided capacity along a 5 kilometre private wire, but with government funding, we're able to extend that right up to the top of the Oxford Ring Road. So it's now going to be a 9.5 kilometre ring road, private wire. which yeah, I mean, I think that just shows that if you're going to be creating some disruption, it makes sense to try and make sure that you're then able to provide services into the long term.
Okay, Tom, just then on these kind of the idea of the decentralized charging hub with its, you know, solar and its battery and its services back to the network, and as well, you know, bringing together a sort of energy solution along with the transport solution. Do you see that coming forward? Is that part of your model, other competitors' model, or is it just actually a kind of turned out to be a bit too complicated?
No, it's totally doable. I think historically for us, both in this country and in the Netherlands in particular, it's always been cheaper to get a grid connection than to install batteries, for example. Likewise, the land and the real estate required for the actual solar farm itself can be a challenge. You've got the advantage in this country, of course, that there has been a lot of work done in the past with the feed-in tariffs. There are a number of solar farms that were consented and were ready to build, and then, you know, the feed-in tariff was sort of retrospectively stopped, etc. So there are definitely opportunities for that sort of thing. There will be times when, regardless of how much public funding might be available, it's not possible to bring a 33 kV connection economically to a site. And that's where, you know, maybe tapping off an 11 kV is appropriate. But it has to be, you always need megawatts. And what you'll see there is batteries, undoubtedly. I mean, the big thing that we have, regardless of the amount of solar and battery that you install, you always need a big grid connection, or the ability to charge up your battery very quickly, basically. So we see on our busiest sites, you know, there's less than a minute between charge sessions at peak times. That's not the time to charge a big battery on a small grid connection. You need megawatts, basically, if you're going to do that. So our route, whatever happens, is going to be focused on those multi-megawatt connections, generally always at the HV level, so 11,000 volts and above. And I think that for us is the safest path as well. It gives us real independence.
Excellent. Okay, Sarah, more on the kind of integrated solutions that you know, are mixing together energy services with transport services. Does that seem to stack up? Is that the direction, or do you just still need this big grid connection? And if you can get in a bit of solar, a bit of battery, then great as an add-on, but it's not really core to the solution.
Yeah, I think we've looked at several kind of developers that have this kind of stacked model whereby they integrate solar, battery, EV charging. I think some of the difficulties around those solutions is, you know, when you want to be trading in the markets with your battery, it could well be the times when people have the highest demand on the road network, i.e. more people are turning up to your hub to charge their car. So you can't actively be trading your battery in the market or give your battery to a trader to trade in the market if you've got that capacity without having a big connection. So in some respects, you're almost doubling down on your capex to have the big grid connection, then put a battery on top of it, when your kind of peak times for using that connection for the battery and for the EVs could be the same time. So stacking up how that all comes together is quite challenging. But it's certainly something that we're looking at, and we are assessing those opportunities. But yeah, it's not necessarily obvious as to how that's all going to come together.
Excellent. Okay. Erin, just to give us a bit more sense of the timescales then with Project Rapid. We've heard about the kind of different models that people are looking at, and lots of businesses looking into this space, and you're obviously thinking about it yourselves. Do you, you know, when does Treasury money start getting spent, I guess?
So we're working as quickly as we can in the current environment. We would like to maintain the momentum that we have with Project Rapid. Nevertheless, there are hurdles to jump through, and the first one is developing review and making the case again, in particular for Project Rapid and MSA connections. Then there is the not small matter of designing precisely how the intervention works, and that's something that we are working on in parallel. Obviously, we have the onus is on us to spend government money wisely, and we are particularly focused on the non-commercial connections. So developing a solution that spends money sensibly and only where it is needed is a key aspect of the work, because some of these connections, some of these rapid hubs are clearly going to be fully commercial private propositions, and it is not at all helpful for the government to come intervening in space where it isn't actually required. So there's a careful balance to be struck in getting our interventions where they need to be and not where they don't need to be. So the short answer to your question is as soon as possible. Slightly longer one is that it's going to take a little bit of time, and there's much work to be done still.
Okay, excellent. Paul, can I just ask, sort of going back to the sort of fundamental question at the beginning? We are stepping back, as I said, we are taking this huge, this supply chain of the oil industry, who has kind of dominated the 20th century, the oil industry, and having its challenges at the moment. I know, but super tankers, refineries, all to bring our oil into our to the energy to get our vehicles around, and it's all going through your network now, or by 2035, or whenever. Is that can you cope? You're looking pretty relaxed at the moment.
Yeah, of course we can cope. And if we can't cope, we build assets, and we're an asset company. So why wouldn't that be a good thing? Our revenues are all related to people using electricity. In the early days of electric vehicles, there was lots and lots of press about, the grid won't cope. And let's start with domestic customers, because people that buy electric vehicles at the moment tend to be people that can afford to buy a brand new car, because that's normally the only way you can get hold of one. That means they tend to be customers that have a driveway or a garage. So we're looking at the domestic market first. When we did Electric Nation, and when we then issued our electric vehicle strategy documents, we were looking at that, and we were looking at the inherent capacity that exists in the sort of distribution substations at the end of the street, and the network that supports those. And we sort of worked out that we've got enough energy available, if you like, spare capacity available, to give every customer one 35 kilowatt hour charge per week. And that's sort of a charge for your Nissan Leaf or a sort of small family car. And it gives you around about 150 miles in most of those cars. Do that once a week, and you're automatically at the sort of 8,000 miles a year average mileage that Department for Transport state in their transport surveys. So the sort of the basic question of, is there enough energy available for people to get around? If they're all average users, there will be. We get questions about, what about I do 250 miles a day. I can't possibly charge at home. Maybe you can't, but if you're doing 250 miles a day, you're probably driving past motorway services too. And also, even if you did charge at home, on the law of averages, somebody in your street is only doing 10 miles a day, because that's how the averages work. So I'm relatively relaxed about that. There will be parts of our network that need reinforcing. There will be areas where we get pinch points. But I always worry about the street where one person gets an electric vehicle, the neighbours all think it's an absolutely brilliant car, and then you suddenly find there's 6 or 7 of them in the same street. And we've got mitigations for that. And the only message we pass back to our regulator is, we'll be confident that we can support that demand, so long as you keep letting us build network where we need to and keep reinforcing where we need to. So I'm not too concerned.
That message going, Paul, as you come up to a price review?
Yeah, I think that message is going okay coming up to the price review, to be honest. And actually, in the scale of all the other works that we complete in a price review period, the money we'd spend on reinforcing for any low carbon technologies is quite a small amount. So I don't think it's a huge hurdle for us. I don't think there's anything to worry about in that area.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's all. That's definitely very reassuring. Sarah, just give us a little more, a bit, any more insight you can give us on the kind of types of models that you're seeing? I mean, probably in your position, you see as much of many of the kind of business models and opportunities coming forward. You've mentioned InstaVolt as a example. any more you can kind of insight into what sort of models are coming forward and looking for investment?
Yes, so I think we're quite keen to make sure that we're covering kind of the entire spectrum of public charging. So that's servicing people who want a on-street slow charger outside their home in a large town and city where there is less off-street parking, through to destination type charging to serve people who perhaps want to charge once a week when they go on their supermarket shop, or perhaps go to McDonald's and stay there for half an hour and charge their car while they're at that location, or perhaps gym members, etc. We then want to make sure we're addressing the kind of strategic road need as well. And Instavolt is partly answering that question for us. They have a high presence on A roads in particular, but they haven't done anything along the motorways yet because, partly I think grid is very expensive on the motorway locations. There's an incumbent network provider on those motorway areas already, so that's not somewhere where Instavolt's been able to touch. But in terms of kind of other models that we are coming across for the hubs, I think they're quite diverse in terms of what they're trying to address. Some are looking to kind of serve particular densities of populations, i.e. they're hubs that are placed strategically around cities where people don't have access to off-street parking, and therefore we think there's a requirement for a hub. Where people do have a high access to off-street parking, so rural areas, kind of lots of space, we don't necessarily think a hub with a high density of charges is the right answer, because there will be other opportunities for those people to charge either on street or at kind of these smaller destination type units. So hubs for us are really something to address on the strategic road networks, so that's being the motorways and the A roads, and in and around big cities. And I think that again is two separate models, because in and around big cities, it's where people are going to go for half an hour to serve a need. So maybe, they're going to do their weekly shop and want to be able to do that. On a strategic road network, we do see that as more of a kind of in and out stop. But again, it all depends on kind of the space available, the grid available, and what we put there.
Okay, I mean, mentioning some of those areas and thinking about where the commercial models are, I guess that does leave the risk of rural areas of mid Wales or wherever, the southwest of England being rather underserved. And as you look at the models coming forward, why would anyone put something out there? Is that a concern?
I don't think so. I think it's still somewhere where we're looking to address, and I think there's still a very strong commercial model there, because there are people who are driving and will need to charge. But I don't necessarily see a scenario there whereby you need to build a dedicated hub where you have kind of 10, 20, 150 kilowatt chargers, because that population is probably where you do have only 20% of people without off-street parking. And you can probably serve that need quite well through a more distributed model. I think the hubs, because of the density of capital commitment and everything else, are really serving high density areas. So busy roads, strategic roads, MSAs, and the busier towns and cities where you've got high populations of people without off-street parking who will kind of visit that hub specifically to charge and fill in another activity. So for us, I don't see a situation where you won't be able to find a charger in your vicinity that's public and easy to use. And I think Instavolt, if you look at the distribution of their network already, they're kind of up near John O'Groats in Scotland and all the way down to Land's End in Cornwall. I mean, they're being extremes, but they're on those roads, and that is the coverage that you would expect on a network like that, where it's a distributed model, but where you are pouring in kind of a high density of capital, you want to be sure that the demand's there. And in terms of commercializing those models, I think when you are looking at that kind of higher capital commitment, it's when you start thinking about revenue stacking. So can I get a kind of primary tenant, a fleet perhaps, to guarantee a certain utilization? Or even if they're not going to guarantee it, can I see a fleet that's passing often enough to say, well, actually, we think we will charge X amount of kilowatt hours. And if you start building it from there, you start seeing, well, actually, this is where I can put a hub and be more confident that that capital is going to be well used and well placed.
Okay, coming towards the end, so I might just ask Millie and then Tom for a kind of final comment on what your projection for the kind of ultra rapid charging is how quickly are they going to come forward? What do you think the key characteristics will be? And is this a kind of imminent thing in the next year, 5 years, 10 years before we have a kind of real kind of hub network that's going to give everyone confidence in the switch to EVs, particularly, I guess, the less early adopters. Lily, do you want to kind of find a thought first?
I think, well, Pivot Power has always been rather bullish about where we see the electric vehicle market going. We made predictions back in 2019 about when parity of total cost of ownership would be reached. We were saying 2024, and actually, in fact, some models cost parity has already been achieved, and it's looking like it's going to be achieved much sooner. So I think it will happen a lot quicker than people think. We have our hubs that will be coming online over the next few years. In terms of key characteristics, sort of summarising some of the things we've discussed today. Being future-proofed, scalable, having the capacity to cope with the future demand, creating a seamless experience for users, making sure that the hardware is well maintained, and that also it is able to be used for future vehicles with different power requirements. And also to recognise that it won't be a one-size-fits-all approach. Solutions have to be delivered that cater for the demand of a local area, and that will be massively varied depending on where you are. So I think that's obviously a challenge as well for government policy to really make sure that it's well suited to the local demands.
Excellent. Okay, one input from the floor, so to speak. Paul is debating your 35 kilowatts for 150 miles. They suggest more of 100 miles is the argument, which would probably account quite a bit closer to my maybe 150 my Leaf, I think. But maybe your EV is more efficient.
Maybe I'm being a bit too optimistic. But the other thing that we find with those numbers as well is that we run the numbers we run is on the maximum demands of the transformers, and there's a bit more capacity again because a lot of customers who've got access to an off-peak tariff would charge when our network isn't running as heavily loaded as it is in the early evening anyway. So if my maths is wrong, I'm sorry, but I think there's still a reasonable amount of capacity available.
Okay, you're still relaxed. Okay, good. Tom, the kind of final word on the the rollout of this and the type of kind of hubs that we're going to see, and the speed of which this is going to happen.
Sure. I mean, I see. I mean, not to be like flippant or anything, but I see no reason why every single MSA shouldn't have a hub, as it were, in the future. There's no reason other than potentially focusing on the more high demand or ones that are near the more key routes. Why they shouldn't be expected to be charging points in the future. It is a strategic road network. It has a key function in keeping the economy going and keeping people moving. In terms of the speed, I know, Fastnet included, there are a number of companies that would bite the hands off of government to get access to locations on the MSAs, and to do so with their own investment. The real question is indeed, what is the role for the taxpayer? What is the role for government in making some of this happen? We see where investment is mobilized from the government, whether that's in grant form, other kind of indirect subsidies. Through the EV market is such that you're naturally favoring the incumbent, and I think that's a challenge. Obviously, smaller companies, startups, and the like, their lives are more hard than ever, as it were, to sort of be in with a shot and doing something properly. So what you'd like to see, where government support is coming on, that it's there is competition for connections. The challenge is, geographically speaking, that's not doable. So then you say, okay, well, can we open up competition for locations? And the government, I mean, Aaron's already talked to this to an extent, but it has taken powers. It's already got powers in the form of DFT's regulation of the MSAs, for example. Obviously, we're quite happy to do compulsory purchase of people's houses, people's livelihoods for the creation of strategic rail links. I think compulsory purchase of a few parking bays or agricultural land next to a motorway service area, for example, wouldn't necessarily be out of the question and wouldn't bat as many eyelids as some of our other infrastructure projects might. So like I say, I think it's absolutely clear every motorway service area has a role in facilitating electric transport, both for private vehicles and for fleets, larger vehicles, absolutely. And this is what we're seeing in the Netherlands. Let's make it happen. But I hope that where there is, taxpayer-funded support, that is at least delivered in a fair, open, and transparent way, where everyone in the market has an opportunity to compete and really deliver good things for the driver.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Tom. Paul's been very reassuring about the network and WPD. Is that your experience that you can get grid connection? You need it, or is it a complex picture? Just very briefly, how much of a barrier you see at the moment from accessing the grid connections that you need? Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait, sorry, this is for me. Oh my gosh,
Yes.
I almost switched off because you said Paul. Sorry, I heard Paul. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, just Paul's kind of talked to us about how WPD is approaching this and sort of reassuring, I guess, that there is capacity available. And are you finding the cost of grid connections and getting grid connections a key barrier or a costly issue?
No, for us, there have been a handful of locations where the cost is higher than we would like to see, but then it's just required us to be a bit more innovative about how we make things stack up. Other revenue sources we can bring onto our sites, other means of reducing those costs, looking at what the potential for batteries on our locations might be in the future, for example. Certainly, you hear headline numbers like £1 million here or there, and those do happen. There are some where we were told, I think it wasn't Western Power, maybe it was Western Power, come back in 10 years or something because that area's just got nothing, and that's fine. That happens. Really, barriers
Send
for
you
us.
Paul's email.
Yeah, I think it's a location story, and there it's just a process of again finding the right locations that work for the drivers, that work for us, that enable us to do what we do and what we believe is in the interests of drivers. And making that happen. So it's those two elements combined, I guess.
Okay, excellent. Sarah, final word just on the charging behaviour. I mean, in thinking about these models, you have to think about that. You'd be broad term. Do you think most people are going to, the percentage of the energy used in EVs, is it going to be sort of 80% comes from homes? Is this, in a few years, is this going to be 80% that's done on the strategic road network? Is it not quite as simple as that? Do we just have no idea? How do you see that?
So based on our kind of internal forecasts, I think today the kind of 20% happening in the public, 80% happening at home or at the workplace is broadly accepted. I think as EV uptake accelerates, we will see more charging happen on the public network, because you will get more kind of people who don't have the easy, obvious access to home or workplace charging adopting EVs, and they will rely more and more on the network. But I still think it will form a smaller part of the equation, just purely on a convenience factor. Nevertheless, I think it's important that it's there, it's important that it's reliable, and it's important that it kind of serves the people who need it where they need it, whether that is in kind of rural Wales, as you mentioned. There needs to be enough charging to serve the population that need public charging there. And where there is the higher density of people looking for the public chargers, we need to have the kind of the density put up in those areas. And that's very much what our fund is addressing.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. It's very helpful. Erin, I'll give them last word, I guess, to government. I mean, you've got talking about a transport decarbonisation plan by the end of the year. This is the biggest, 27% of UK carbon emissions, I think, isn't it? Transforming the whole fleet essentially from a fossil fuel to an EV fleet. And are you as calm as Paul here? Is it all under control, or what do you see as the biggest challenge in that whole thing, or what keeps you guys up at night?
I think what worries me most is the pace of change required. I mean, we are talking about a revolution in a relatively short period of time. And I think that with a whole lot of uncertainty in the mix, I think clarifying the date and putting in clear measures in place to achieve the date will help a lot in terms of giving certainty, because some of what holds back investment in infrastructure, for example, is not being clear about what the uptick, what the sort of rate of increase in electric vehicles actually is. So if you can fix some element of the future and be clear about it, it makes it an awful lot easier for companies to invest to fulfill that need. So yeah, the timing, I think, is the big challenge. That the element of uncertainty, some of that can be reduced.
Excellent, Erin. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists. You've managed to keep, I think we're just at 300 participants still, so you've managed to keep over 300 people's interest for 2 hours on a webinar. That's got to be that's some achievement there. So thank you very much, everyone, for your answers. A couple of questions about, we will circulate Erin's slides afterwards, so that'll happen. So, and as I say, there's some interesting comments which perhaps Erin might feed into your consultation thinking on the Q&A. So we'll feed that on to you. Just a final couple of thoughts from Regen. At this time, one of the things we are obviously doing as a kind of from our membership organisation basis, feeding back to government any issues that are particularly affecting the sector to do with the COVID situation. So if people want to pass anything on to us, as well as course direct to government, then let us know. I was in contact with the heat team in Bays yesterday about renewable heat incentive, for example. So across the different bits of this whole energy transition, there will be some implications. So we'd be happy to pass that on, and we'll be doing some thinking about the sort of, like many are starting to do, about as we come out of this, what the opportunities are. And EVs, I think, perhaps form a part of that narrative we talked about. Finally, a couple of other Regen events coming up. Rach, do you want to try and share that list? If this works. That's Regen's website. It's gone again. There, Rich. So perhaps we're trying a little bit too complicated there. There's one more go. Okay, excellent. Future Regen events. Lovely, thank you. So we'll be doing other things. We're coming up. We've got a session in our Women in Renewable Energy program. We have a work program around women encouraging diversity in this sector. We have an interesting session on the 28th of April with Roisin Quinn, who's Chief Engineer at National Grid ESO. I imagine managing the ESO control centre during this period is quite an interesting place to be. I know a lot of changes in demand patterns that's causing them some implications. It'd be interesting in Paul's views on that as well. So that's 28th of April. These are all on our website. We have a webinar coming up as part of an electricity storage network that Regen runs, and a paper that we're launching there on the kind of position of storage at the moment, the growth and development. 3rd of June, we have a solar developers forum as well as our EV and electricity system forum, and that we're going to wait until we can do in person because it's quite an interactive, engaged event. So those are some of the things coming up. No doubt there'll be more as we do go forward. It just, I think, remains for me to once again thank all our panelists in the usual way and do a virtual clap. I think that's you can imagine that coming back to you from the audience. Paul has officially won the best backdrop award. That's definitely.
That's probably because I've got the worst spare room.
Okay, it's the smartest. I've gone with the traditional books in the background. They are real, not a virtual wall background, and those have been stressed out by the fact they're not very neatly stacked. And I apologise for that. I just have to live with that. So yeah, thanks again to all the panelists, and of course, huge thanks to all of you for participating and feeding back in terms of the Q&A session. It's been great to see so many of you engaging. And finally, I normally wish people a sort of safe journey home, but that wish you more in this difficult time to for you and all your loved ones to stay safe and well. Thank you very much for participating, and we'll talk to you all soon, Danj.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.
Guys.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Cheers.